The morning my mother-in-law handed me a check and told me to leave her son's life, the kitchen smelled like burnt toast and old coffee. The kind of smell that clings to a house that hasn't been happy in a long time. I remember sitting at the table thinking I had done everything right. I had been patient. I had been quiet. I had swallowed things that should never have been swallowed. And still, there was a check on the table in front of me, face down, like she couldn't even look at it herself. I am 31 years old now. I live in a small town outside of Fredericton, New Brunswick, in a house that is mine in every way that matters. I have a dog named Fig and a garden that barely survives the winters and a life that I built from the ground up after someone tried to erase me completely. But I am getting ahead of myself. Because the story does not start with the check. It starts much earlier than that. It starts the way most quiet disasters do. Slowly and with a smile. My name is Cecily. Wait, no. My name is Vivienne. I have started this so many times in my head that I sometimes lose track of where the telling begins. Let me start again. My name is Rowena. I am 31 years old. And I was married once, briefly and badly, to a man who loved his mother more than he loved me, more than he loved the truth, more than he loved anything that did not reflect back his own comfort. His name does not matter. What matters is what happened when I found out who I really was. And what happened when the people who had spent years trying to make me small discovered that they had accidentally given me the only thing I had ever needed. I grew up in Moncton, New Brunswick, the only child of two people who were quietly unhappy with each other and did not bother to hide it. My father left when I was 11. Not dramatically. No shouting, no final scene at the door. He just one day packed a bag while I was at school, and by the time I got home, my mother was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she had not touched, and the hook by the back door where his jacket usually hung was empty. That empty hook stayed in my mind for years. The absence of a thing can be louder than the thing itself. My mother was a practical woman. She went back to work the following Monday. She fed me, clothed me, got me through school. She did not explain, and she did not grieve out loud. She moved through the years that followed with the kind of efficiency that looks like strength from a distance but feels like isolation when you are the child living inside it. I loved her. I never doubted that she loved me. But there was a door in her that I was never allowed to open, and I stopped knocking on it somewhere around the age of 15. I met my ex-husband at a work event in Halifax. I had moved there after university, working in administration at a mid-sized engineering firm. He was charming in the way that certain men are charming when they want something. He laughed at the right moments. He held doors. He called when he said he would call. After years of learning to expect nothing from people, I did not know how to read the difference between a man who was genuinely kind and a man who was performing kindness until he had what he wanted. I was 24. I thought I had been careful. We dated for 2 years before he asked me to marry him. I said yes on the dock of a rented cottage in the Annapolis Valley, with the sun going down over the water and everything looking like it meant something. I should have paid more attention to the fact that his mother was waiting for us back at the cottage. That she had insisted on being there for the weekend. That even in that moment, he had looked over my shoulder toward the window of the house before he looked at my face. His mother was a woman who occupied every room she entered. Not loudly. She was not loud, she was precise. The kind of woman who notices when a dish has been placed back in the cupboard at a slightly wrong angle and says nothing but remembers. From the first time I met her, I understood that she had a version of her son in her mind, a careful, constructed version, and that any woman he chose would be measured permanently against a standard that had nothing to do with reality and everything to do with control. She was polite to me the way someone is polite to a temporary inconvenience. She complimented my cooking once in 3 years, and I remember the exact day it happened because I wrote it in my journal that night. I am not exaggerating when I say that was the only compliment she ever offered me directly. Everything else came as suggestion. My curtains were a difficult color. My method of making gravy was interesting. I might find it easier to keep the house if I followed a proper schedule. My ex-husband said she was just being helpful. He said it every single time. He said it with the exhausted certainty of a man who had been saying it his whole life, and no longer heard it as a sentence, just as a reflex. The money came from his mother's side of the family. His father had died years before I entered the picture, leaving a comfortable sum and a business his mother had since sold. She held the finances the way she held everything. Carefully, quietly, with both hands. My ex-husband worked, and worked reasonably well, but we both knew whose name the real weight sat under. I had my own income and my own savings, and I had never once asked for a dollar that wasn't mine to ask for. That did not matter. In her mind, I was someone who had arrived near her money, and that was enough. The marriage lasted 3 years before I understood that I was not living in a marriage. I was living in an audition that I was never going to pass. My ex-husband was not a cruel man. That is the complicated part. He was a man who had been raised to please one woman above all others, and when that priority came into conflict with anything else in his life, the priority always won. He was not mean to me. He was absent. There is a particular loneliness in being in a room with someone who has already chosen somewhere else to be. I will not say there was one moment when everything broke. It was more like a slow leak. A drip that you ignore because it seems manageable until the day you notice the floor has rotted through underneath you. The end came on a Tuesday in February, which is a very Canadian kind of day to have your life fall apart. Gray sky, a bit of ice on the porch, temperature sitting at that particular miserable degree where it is not cold enough to be interesting and not warm enough to be bearable. I had taken a day off work because I was exhausted in a way that sleep wasn't fixing. I was sitting on the couch in the kind of blank stillness you sit in when your body has decided to stop pretending, and I heard the front door open and both of them come in. His voice. Her voice. They had clearly not expected me to be home. I did not move. I listened. I am not proud of that. But I listened. What I heard was not a fight. It was not a confrontation. It was a conversation between two people who were entirely comfortable with each other and entirely comfortable with what they were discussing, which was me, and how much longer this was going to be necessary, and what the cleanest way out would be, and whether I had any idea, and the conclusion they had both arrived at calmly was that I did not. I sat on that couch for a long time after I heard them go into the kitchen. I do not know what I felt. Something had been confirmed that I had not admitted to myself I had been suspecting for a long time. It is a strange thing to feel simultaneously devastated and unsurprised. I went upstairs and I sat on the edge of the bed and I thought very clearly and very slowly about what I was going to do. I was not going to cause a scene. I was not going to cry where she could see it. I was not going to give either of them the version of this that they expected, which was me crumbling and needing to be managed. I came downstairs. My ex-husband was at the counter with his back to me. His mother was at the kitchen table. She looked up when I walked in. For just 1 second, something moved across her face. I could not tell if it was guilt or calculation. With her, those two things often looked the same. I said very quietly that I had heard them come in. I did not say anything else. I just stood there and let the silence do the work. My ex-husband turned around. His face was the face of a man caught in something he did not know how to name because he had never had to name it before. His mother straightened in her chair. She picked up her cup of tea, she set it down, and then she reached into her bag and placed an envelope on the table. She pushed it toward me with 2 fingers. She said it was for my transition, that word. Transition, like I was a weather system that needed to move on. I did not pick it up. I looked at it for a long time. Then I looked at her and I said, I don't want your money. I walked upstairs, packed what I could carry in 2 bags, and I left. I drove north on the highway for 4 hours with the radio off and the heat on full, because February in Nova Scotia has no interest in your emotional state. I drove north until I could not think of a reason to stop, and then I stopped at a Tim Hortons outside Truro and sat in the parking lot for a long time with a coffee I did not drink. My phone had 9 missed calls. None of them were from my mother. None of them were from anyone who had ever actually known me. I called my mother. She picked up on the second ring. I said I left. She did not ask me any questions. She said, come home then. That was it. 2 words, the most useful 2 words anyone had said to me in 3 years. I drove to Moncton. I slept in my childhood bedroom for the first time in 9 years, in a bed that was too small, under a quilt my mother had made when I was in high school. I lay there in the dark and I did not feel sorry for myself. I felt quiet. The same kind of quiet I had felt at that kitchen table back in Halifax, the numb kind, the hollow kind. Except this time it did not frighten me. This time it felt like the beginning of something rather than the end. I stayed with my mother for 2 weeks. On the 4th day, she asked me if I had eaten anything other than crackers, and I said probably not, and she made a pot of potato soup, and we sat at her kitchen table the way we had not sat together since I was a teenager, and somewhere in the middle of that meal, she said there was something she had been meaning to tell me for a long time. I looked up. She had her hands around her bowl. She was looking at the table. She said that she had made a decision when I was very young, a decision she had made because she was frightened and because she thought it was protecting me, and that she was not sure anymore that it had been the right one, and that I was an adult now, had been an adult for a long time, and that I deserved to know the truth. I put my spoon down. She told me that when she was 22 years old, just before she had me, she had been involved with two men at the same time, briefly and not proudly. One of them was the man I had grown up knowing as my father, the man who had left when I was 11, the man whose jacket hook had been empty. The other was a man named Percival, a Nigerian-Canadian man from a family that had settled in New Brunswick 2 generations back. A man who had been her closest friend first, then briefly something more, then nothing at all because she had been young and afraid of what her own mother would say, and she had made a choice that was about fear and not about truth. She said she had never been entirely certain which man was my biological father. She said she had told herself it did not matter, that the man she had married was my father in every way that counted, and then he left. And for years she had continued telling herself it did not matter, because what would she do with it now? What would any of us do? But she said that Percival had reached out to her 6 months ago, that he had never married, that he had kept track of her in the quiet way that people sometimes do when they are not ready to fully let go. That when his own mother had died last spring, and he had found himself sorting through decades of the past, he had written to my mother and said he had often wondered. She slid a piece of paper across the table to me. It was a printed email. A few paragraphs. Clear, careful handwriting in the body of the message, the kind of English a person chooses very deliberately, because they want to be understood and not misread. The last line of the email said, "I would understand completely if Rowena doesn't want to know. But if she ever does, I am not going anywhere." I held that piece of paper for a long time. My mother watched me the way a person watches something breakable. I was not going to, but I did not tell her that yet. I asked her where he lived. She said Sackville, 45 minutes down the road. I do not know exactly what I felt in that moment. It was not shock. It was something slower than shock. Something that moved through me, the way cold water moves through a cavity it has been filling for years without you noticing. Something that had always been a shape without a name was now beginning to have one. I drove to Sackville on a Saturday morning 2 weeks later, because I needed 2 weeks. I needed to sit with the idea of this man, this possibility, this version of myself I had never been offered, and I needed to be sure that when I went, I was going because I wanted to, and not because I was desperate. Not because my marriage had just ended and I was looking for something solid to hold on to. The distinction mattered to me. I was not going to arrive at this man's door as a wound looking for a bandage. I was going to arrive as a person who had made a choice. His house was on a side street near the university, a small, clean brick house with a porch that had clearly been added on later, not matching exactly but cared for. There were bird feeders, 3 of them, each a different style, hung from the eaves. He was in the yard when I pulled up. He must have been watching for the car. He was tall, in his early 60s, with gray at his temples and the kind of face that does not arrange itself into easy expressions, that holds things steadily rather than performing them. He was wearing a heavy canvas jacket and holding a pair of gardening gloves, and he stood very still when I got out of the car, as if any movement might startle something. I walked up to the fence. He said my name just once. Just Rowena. And the way a person says your name when they have been holding it quietly inside their chest for a very long time is different from every other way your name has ever been said. I cannot explain it better than that. He said, "Thank you for coming." I said I wanted to. We sat on his porch for 3 hours that first afternoon. He did not try to make it mean everything at once. He told me about his family, about the 2 generations of Okafors who had built something solid in New Brunswick, about his own work as a retired high school teacher, about the years between, the choices, the ones he regretted. He did not ask me to forgive anyone. He did not ask me to feel any particular way. He just talked to me the way a person talks to someone they have been thinking about for a long time and are still not entirely sure is real. He told me, toward the end of that afternoon, that he had asked my mother if she would be willing to do a DNA test. Not to force anything, just to know. He said he had learned, late in life, that not knowing something is not the same as it not existing. I said I would think about it. I thought about it for 1 week, and then I called him and said yes. The results came back 6 weeks later. He was my biological father. I will tell you something about the moment I read those results. I was alone in my apartment in Fredericton, where I had moved after leaving my mother's house, setting up something small and mine. I was sitting at my kitchen table, which I had bought secondhand from a woman in Oromocto for $40, and the light in the apartment at that time of morning comes through the east window and sits on the table in a certain way, and I read the results twice, slowly. And then I sat in that light for a very long time without moving. I had spent my whole adult life feeling like I was slightly outside of the story everyone around me was living. Like there was a version of belonging that other people understood instinctively, and that I was always half a step behind. I had married a man partly because his family seemed so certain of themselves, so rooted, and I had believed, somewhere I had never examined very clearly, that if I stayed close enough to that certainty it might transfer to me. It had not. It never does. Certainty borrowed from other people is not the same as the kind that grows from knowing where you actually come from. And here, in this test result, in the number on the page that was not a number but a confirmation, was the beginning of a different kind of knowing. I called Percival that afternoon. He answered on the first ring. I said, "I think you probably already know what I'm about to say." He said, "I hoped." Not that he knew. That he hoped. That distinction told me something important about him. We talked for an hour, and then more the following week, and the week after that. I want to be honest about what followed, because the honest version is not a simple one. There was joy in it, real joy, the kind that is physical, that sits in your chest differently from ordinary happiness. But there was also grief. Grief for the version of my childhood that might have been different. Grief for the years when I was quietly convinced that something in me was missing, when the thing that was missing was not inside me at all, but had been kept just down the road in a brick house with bird feeders. I did not want to spend years inside that grief. I had already spent years inside other people's silences, and I was not going to build a home in another one. So I felt it and I moved through it. My mother and I talked about it, more than once, more than I expected. She did not defend herself at length. She said she was sorry in the way that people say sorry when they mean it completely and know it does not fix anything and say it anyway, because it is true. I believed her. I also decided that I did not need to arrive at forgiveness on anyone else's timetable but my own, and that me choosing to continue having a relationship with her was not the same as me pretending the things she had done did not matter. These are things I figured out slowly. What I did not do was go back to the people who had sat at a kitchen table deciding what to do with me. My ex-husband called twice after I left. His mother did not call at all, which told me everything I had always known about what I had represented to her. I did not return either call. Not out of anger. I want to be clear about that because I have had a lot of time now to understand the difference between anger and clarity. I did not return their calls because the conversation would have been about them. About his feelings, about her justifications, about the version of the story that made sense from inside that kitchen. And I had stopped being interested in stories that did not include me as a full person. What they had intended to push me out with, that check on the kitchen table, that smooth word transition, had pushed me all the way north to a February parking lot in Truro, and a bowl of potato soup and a piece of paper slid across a table by my mother's hands, and a man standing still in his yard holding gardening gloves, as if afraid to startle something real. I am 31. I have a relationship with Percival that is still young in the way new things are young, careful and full of attention. He came for dinner at my apartment in Fredericton last October and brought a bottle of wine from a New Brunswick winery, and we talked until almost midnight about things that had nothing to do with the past. At some point I looked at him across the table, and I could see something of myself in the way he listened, in the way he paused before answering, in the particular shape of the quiet between his words. I had never seen myself in another person's face before. I did not know what that felt like until it happened. My mother came for Christmas. Percival came on Boxing Day. The three of us sat in my small apartment with Fig the dog underfoot and snow coming down outside the window, and I made a meal that was too ambitious for my kitchen, and we laughed about it, and I thought, looking at the two of them on either side of my table, that this was not the family I had expected to end up with. It was not the family I had tried to marry into, not the version with the right last name and the old money and the kitchen, where everything had its precise place. It was smaller and stranger and newer and entirely real. There is something I think about sometimes when I am in the garden, trying to coax things to grow through a New Brunswick summer that is never quite long enough. I think about the woman who sat at that kitchen table with a check and the word transition, who believed she was ending something. I do not think about her with bitterness. I have worked through that, slowly and honestly, over the past 2 years. I think about her with something closer to pity and something closer to gratitude, and those two things can coexist. I know that now. She thought she was showing me the door. She was right about that. Just not about what was on the other side of it. If any part of this story found something in you, you are not alone in it. The people who try to tell you that you do not belong somewhere are sometimes, without knowing it, pointing you toward where you actually do. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. Hit the bell. Someone out there is sitting in a parking lot with a cold coffee right now, and they need to hear that the road does not end there.